Hi, everybody. So we're going to get started with our um, Milestone 4 group critique. And in this particular assignment, what you were doing is adding a background and then maybe doing a little bit more work on your text treatment. And really the purpose of the background and text is to just provide some more, in a way, a kind of a context for your character. It can add, like, depending upon the text you choose, it can give it sort of a certain kind of character flavor. Maybe make it a little bit more terrible or a little bit more glittery. Make it look a little kind of rougher with Garbage Dump Dan. There's all kinds of possibilities here for how your text can just add that little bit of flavor. And then your background was going to also provide a context for your character, like maybe the environment that your character resides in some way. So at this phase, we're really just going to focus on talking about the background and text. We're going to also talk about the character design and keep pushing that forward. Look, we're going to go back to layer masks and see if there's anything we can do with that. So that's what we're going to be really talking about today. And then next week we'll maybe start talking a little bit more about color, for example. But this week we're going to focus on character design, background, um, and and text, and then the technical part, and see if we can move all of your work. Just move it. We're always aiming to try to move it to the next level each of these weeks and kind of build incrementally. So I would say, just looking at the thumbnails here, that I would say that people are starting to develop some really interesting backgrounds. And I think the balance here is always to make sure that you have a background that is simple enough but has enough character, like enough kind of context. So I would say that maybe Ashley and Janessa, just looking at yours, just looking at the thumbnail views, and maybe Kira too, there's sort of a sense of simplicity and context in it that I think is starting to head in a good direction. We'll talk more about what we can do to keep working on it. Um, and we'll look at everybody else's too. I just actually, maybe let's just take a quick look at, I have some examples here that I posted in the welcome announcement. I thought we would take another quick look at them. These are just student projects that I pulled from week 6. So these are definitely more polished, and yours aren't going to be this polished yet, and that's fine. We've got lots more time to do that in class. But just to kind of see, what makes each of these backgrounds work. I think when you add a background, a lot of times you've been looking at your character, just the character itself, for a really long time, whereas you've been working on your character, and so you actually know it quite well. And then when you add a background, you may not be able to quite see how the background interacts with the character as somebody who's looking at your character for the first time. So there is a tendency that people tend to put more complicated or busy backgrounds behind their character. And I think it's just because we tend to look at our own work for a long time and we don't really recognize, um, how the balance will work. And we sometimes get carried away with the busy background, which makes sense. But if you look at all of these, like let's look at Flippin' Food Fred here. Notice that there's kind of a nice background, but we really see the character standing out quite strongly, and the background is just quite simple. There's an apple off to the side. Notice how the apple is actually off to the side. This is part of the background, off to the side and not behind the character. That allows the character to really stand out. Same with this one. There's a simple background that has a little texture. Blurring. You'll notice there's a couple here, maybe 3 here, that have a blurred background. Well, these two, especially where the photograph is kind of blurred, or kind of, in some way it's got some haze, and those are excellent. If you can find a good photograph with a little blur in it, or you can add it yourself. I have some, video tutorials in the thread that you may have seen. That's a great way of getting a background that has some context, gives you a flavor, in this case, a flavor of the garden and the kind of the rain, and in this one, sort of the, kind of this groovy techno stage. It gives a sense of it, but it doesn't overwhelm the character. It's not competing with the character at all. This one is probably the one with the most detailed background, but it's still fairly simple, and it kind of like the colors and the character really stand out from the background, so it balances, it works, and it also helps that the background has a lot of darker colors in it. So um, Yeah, so that's, I think, the main thing I just wanted to touch upon is the need for really experimenting with your background and really working on that. Like, don't be satisfied necessarily with the first thing you find on the internet. Maybe like find a number of different photographs, and put them into your Photoshop file, turn them on and off, and really kind of move them around, in the background. Just see how it's going to fit into your background, and I'll give you a lot of suggestions today for how to work on that. I think once you get your background in place, a good background, I think and you notice I'm not really talking so much about text because I actually think that almost everybody I've seen in this class tends to do a really excellent job on the text naturally, just really creative, nice text. And we might have some suggestions on that. But in general, I find that people do that really well. It's the background that I think is always typically the challenge. And so we're going to spend some time talking about that today. Okay, and I think that's it for my comments. Um, One final comment is one of the other reasons, too, why the background is so important, why a very simple background, with a lot, essentially what we're looking for is a lot of open space, or we call that negative space in design. That's what we're really looking here. One of the other reasons is that as you notice, when you put your character together, you'll notice that, all of these different objects, you put them together and then, you really want them to look like a character, right? But they are essentially objects that you're kind of in a way really just using magic to kind of put them together and make them look like they belong. If you put a background behind them that's really busy, what happens is, it tends to happen is that the character starts falling apart, that they start just we just see the objects instead of the character because the objects start just kind of fitting in with the background. And that's another reason why this sort of a very kind of sort of smooth background, or kind of background, that's what a background is so important, is because all of that work of putting the character together really relies on all of the other things you do around it for it to remain a character, so that we look at it and go, oh, that's a character, and it's got these cute little arms and it's running sort of, or it's like posing on the stage. This guy's walking towards us, this, Flippin' Food Fred is flipping, and we see all the different parts, and that's how that really happens, is by all the other things that you include around it, or don't include around it. Janessa, so last week, yeah, I remember with your layer masks, they look good. I remember that I think they, in general, I think they were pretty um, cleaned up. I think might see, let's just zoom in here just a tiny bit. Yeah, maybe I might play. So you might have done a little puppet warping, which is awesome. Puppet warping is a great way to add some movement, and I love that you're already starting to do that. But sometimes you need to experiment with the puppet warp, with these little see these little edges here. This one here looks really good. It's nice and smooth. This one looks like maybe it got a little dented in places, and it does happen in puppet warp. You just have to kind of experiment with puppet warp until you get everything smoothed out. It's just a matter of kind of tweaking it. So I might work with that a little bit more. But I love your idea of making, hand on the hip. Um, with this hand, I wanted to ask you what this was. I was a little bit unsure about let's see if I can get that hand. I'm back on my laptop and it takes a little while to get used to. What is this object? It's a little bit hard to make out. It looks like almost like a fake hand. Is that what it is? Kind of like an artificial hand. Yeah, I think I do think it's cute, although it's looking a little, I would love if this was a little more dimensional. Like maybe get a fake hand, something like a prosthetic hand. Why not, and put that on there and have one that has a lot of lights and darks on it. So it seems a little like this is starting to look a little bit like a drawing, and you really want that nice round kind of quality that you have in the other things. So they really look like objects rather than, illustrations or drawings, even though I don't think that's what that is. It just is ending up looking that way. And yes, I do think your background is starting to work quite well. I like your text, just kind of that sort of curve that you've created. what I would say is you want your character to be a bit bigger. It really should fill the space. So what I would be inclined to do is take your text here and move that down. Just you want a nice margin. You don't want to get it too squished at the bottom, but you could move it down a little bit now and then take your character and go all the way down here. And then what do you do about your background? Because you have your background on the, your character on the counter, which is a great idea. What you can do then with your background is just experiment with um, making it bigger. I'm going to hold down the shift key here and just really, see how big can you make it, and then, I would sort of, I'm kind of just moving it around here to see what can I get out of the background. Like, do we need to see, like maybe this bowl of fruit could work, but do we need to see the flowers back here? Or is our eye going to be drawn back there? Do you know what I mean? Like, we don't want the viewer to be looking at something in the background. We want them really to be looking at our character. So that's one of the reasons we really, so okay, there, can you see how now that is, you could even make it even a little bigger just so that half of this, let's just keep doing that, see if we can do that here. If your image can take it in terms of its size, like the resolution, you can always really expand on these guys and just make them really big. And let's see what that looks like now. Sometimes it's just a matter of playing with the image you have. And yeah, I think that's a little bit better, right? So then you'd have maybe just a little bit of, I'm not sure what this is. This is kind of like an odd reflection, or is that part of, oh, that's part of the stove behind there. Maybe when we get into the corrections later on, we might be able to delete that, get rid of that, because it feels like it's also just a little bit in the way, these knobs. Or what you could do is you could also blur the top here, which is maybe what I would be inclined to do, is kind of blur this out a little bit. I have a video in the thread on how to selectively blur things. So you could just blur the top here, just a little bit, kind of get rid of some of these details. So already this is looking so much better in terms of really framing your character. And then we also get this little hint of the apples in here, which is quite cute, you know? So it's just a matter about, a lot of times in design, we think we need to have everything showing. And then, but really in design, what we can often do is use smaller amounts of visual information, like just a little tip of the, of the what's happening on the counter is is better than having the whole thing. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's enough that we see that. So it's about just kind of working on the composition, but again, going back to really framing your character. I kind of really liked the way your ice cream was like a little bit bigger last week. So have you thought about maybe experimenting with just making it bigger? I know that you had some issues with it stretching last week, but maybe just, holding down the shift key and making it a little bit bigger. I don't know what you thought, you might have for a reason thought that that didn't work, but I kind of thought it was pretty cute to have a big hat. But that's definitely up to you whether you want to do that. Okay, so those are my suggestions. I think you're going in a really good direction here. And even though it seems like I had a lot of things that could potentially be changed, this is really where you want to be at this point, in terms of milestone 5, is working this week on balancing everything out. And this is totally like a kind of a natural part of the process of putting this together. It's very rare that somebody at this phase would have everything all worked out, because there's a lot of different moving parts that we're working on. So it's all about experimenting over the 5.5 weeks to end up with a really good result by the end. Okay, Kira. Yes, so actually very similar feedback. Your layer masks look really good from last week. I think your text looks great. I think it really adds to that sense of terrible, kind of that sort of drippy, kind of crazy text, whatever that text is, horror movie text. I think it looks really good. And I like your character design, the way it's coming along, kind of the sad bear. He looks kind of sad and, how did I get here? So I think that's really great. But I would say just the same thing in terms of space. Even though I do like the way you have designed this space, it really does really help this character so much if the character is larger in the space. If you want to put some kind of, later on after the class, if you want to experiment with, you mentioned looking like a poster, if you want to kind of experiment with some other design with your character, that why not? But I would say, take your text, move it up to the top, and then fill the character, really get that character really filling the space. Part of the reason why it's so important to have the character larger and is because the character is made out of these objects, and when they get too small, it's really hard to see the details, how it was built. And then we sort of lose, it really is such a major part of what we're doing here, is building the character, you know, and that's what we're using to, like, technically. So the background too, I think this is a cool background, but it's tending to kind of a lot of detail in the background here. So you could try, I'm not quite sure what this is. Uh, Maybe you could do the same trick that we did with Janessa's and make it larger. I don't know if this one would really lend itself to being larger, but you can try and seeing if you can sort of isolate some different parts in it. Um, so that you get that sense of space, but not so much detail. You could also try that trick of selectively blurring parts out, like blurring out right behind your character. That can help. So those would be, a couple things you could try. But I think that will really help the balance too. One of the reasons too is your background has quite a lot of very saturated, strong color, even though it's cool. And I think that also tends to kind of take over, where I'm really intrigued by the background and I'm not looking at your character, which is something you want to reverse that trend. You want people looking at your character and not at the background so much. The background's just kind of like a background. So I keep experimenting, feel free to kind of experiment with other backgrounds that, like this looks almost like the inside of some kind of, military installation. Maybe you could get an actual photograph, of an installation or maybe the inside of a nuclear power plant or something like that. You could just sort of get some sort of simple background. So, like keep looking around if you want to. If you don't want to, experiment with this one in terms of resizing it or, blurring it or anything like that. Um, but I think you're going in a really good direction here too, and I think you're just need to, keep playing with all of the different parts together. Okay, Ashley, let's see if you said a. Wow, yeah, Nevada test site, 1957. That's a great idea. Yeah, and I think this background, yeah, it looks really good. You could, maybe next week we'll talk more about experimenting with it even more, potentially. But I think for now, I would keep it. The only thing that I'm a little concerned about is how this is kind of, getting slightly in the way of the uh, character's head. Hold on a second here. There we go. So, why isn't that moving? What am I doing here? Sometimes. Oh, I see. Okay. Whoops. So I might sort of maybe shift it around, maybe to the right or to the left. Maybe the bomb could be going sort of, I don't know. I might experiment with a little bit, but I think it's going to work. Um, so I think, and I like your text. I think that looks quite good, in terms of having it all fiery and burning, the bright red, orangey colors. I think that's a great idea. I would just say, so the thing that I'm a little bit concerned about with your character design that I think I mentioned maybe in the gradebook comments, is right now it looks a bit like you've got your dinosaur, who's very cute. Your dinosaur is actually just sitting in a tank, rather than being a character designed from different parts. Does that make sense? So, I might try like figuring out how can you make this look more like a character rather than like the creature in the tank, because we don't want them two separate things. We want them to be one creature, one design. So you might have to kind of experiment a little bit more here. I know you've kind of sort of got it. I think in a way you've got like sort of it solidified a little bit into the design. I know that you're, in the direction you're going, but I think it's good to sort of maybe experiment just a little bit more. For some reason, I'm not able to move things in here. I'm not sure what's going on. Let me investigate. Just a setting that was blocking that. So yeah, I would keep experimenting here with how you can you know, make your character more of a, you know, character. Like maybe you would, you know, use maybe just the bottom of the tank. You know, you'd take out this part perhaps and add something else for the torso. You know, so you would just have the like the this would become the feet, right? And then these would become, you know, these would be moved up here, made a bit bigger so that they could act as arms, you know. So that's what I like, so they would look more like arms. So that's what I probably recommend is just kind of rebuilding this a little bit more. Find something else that doesn't look like a tank to put in here as a, again, as a torso. I think that would probably be the direction I would take with this, you know, to see how that might, you know, solve it. I think you could solve it pretty quickly that way. Um, so yeah, again, I think you're, you know, in on the right track here. I think you're it's pretty normal at this point to want to make revisions in your character and move things around. We'll be doing that really pretty much until the end of the class. So it's good to kind of get those things sort of straightened out now and put whatever time you need into developing your character a little bit more, so that, you know, next week we can focus on other details. Ria, well, I'm glad you were able to solve your Photoshop issue. I know that you went to tutoring and I think they had you reinstall your Photoshop again, which is sometimes, I think you sometimes when you're having problems with Photoshop, you know, especially when we're starting a program, we always think, oh, it's what we're doing, but sometimes things can happen in the program. So I'm glad you were able to do that. Okay, so let's see, looking at last week, um, you have your layer mask, which I think worked out well. And I think your character, yeah, really like the changes you've made with your character. So now you just, as you know, because you've been listening to the group critique, what you want to do here is you want to add some kind of background. And hopefully this discussion has probably given you some good tips for how to select a really simple background. So that's what I do is, you know, find a background or a few backgrounds and play around with them. And then also kind of keep playing with your text treatment just to kind of, um, you know, experiment with some different typefaces to see how it might fit in with your character in the background. Okay, so it looks like you're kind of in a way you're right now, this is your milestone 3, so now you just want to add the parts for milestone 4. Just something about text too, this is just something for everybody. There's something called a vertical type tool in Photoshop, which I wish was harder to get to because it's one of those types of tools that has a good, you know, it has a place. Um, Let's see if I can get it pulled up. I apologize. I'm having still a little bit of problems with my trackpad. Here we are. This is the vertical type tool. What it actually does is it rotates every single letter and rotates it. And again, that can work in certain kinds of instances, but what can sometimes happen, and the reason why people do that is so that they can do what you did here, which is to get vertical type rather than horizontal type. But what can happen then is it can make it hard to read. So it's actually better. So I'll just put Fran here. It's actually better, instead of doing what you did here, is to just use the horizontal type tool and then go to transform. You can actually do it right here. Rotate, let's see, we can either do it clockwise or counterclockwise. Let's try clockwise. I think it would be better counterclockwise. Let's try that other way. So this way, so if you had all the text all lined up, you know, it's actually, then you'd have the same placement where you want to put it, but it's actually easier to read because our mind doesn't, our eye or our mind doesn't have to rotate each of these letters. We just have to read sideways, which people are more comfortable doing. So I would just change it that way. It's, you know, this is not a typography class, but I always like to share that tip because it can save you a lot of frustration later on when you're working on text. Okay, so I would just get started and, you know, experiment with some backgrounds in text. Mike Yang. Okay, well, I love the idea of, you know, purple being a kind of a, you know, dominant theme for your project. I think that's a great direction to go. We'll talk more about color next week, but I just wanted to comment that I think purple is a really nice color, and I think your text up here, I think that looks really good. It's very clear, easy to read, yet it has some character. So I think that looks really great. I would say that your background, I would keep experimenting with different backgrounds. Right now, I think you're having sort of a little bit of that situation of the background really becoming like just sort of kind of immersing your character and making it hard to see your character. If we turn off the background, suddenly we start seeing the character. So you want, I mean, you do want to have a background, of course, but you want to make sure that it's when you're finished, it should still read pretty strongly as if you don't have any backgrounds. So I would keep experimenting. I love the idea of having a plant background. Um, those examples we looked at the beginning, those 6 finished projects, maybe you got some ideas there for how to work with a simpler, maybe a blurred background, one with a little rain or a little dew or, whatever, just like a kind of a close-up of a plant, something that is simple, like really background. So keep experimenting. Keep applying some of the feedback that I mentioned last week to keep experimenting with your character. I mentioned, maybe redesigning this, cleaning up your layer mask lines here, and definitely make your character bigger. Should definitely be quite a lot larger than you've made it, just so that it really stands out. So keep experimenting. Maybe you'd have some arms on your character or, something else happening with it just to kind of keep evolving it just a little bit more. Okay, that's what I'd keep working on. I think, don't hesitate to really, again, like I've mentioned to other folks, experiment with a few different backgrounds. And if you want to submit them to the final submission area with a few different, possible backgrounds, I can always tell you which one I think is the strongest. And anybody, if you want to do that, it's always good to kind of look through a few, like kind of a collection of images to see before you settle on one. Okay, Iman. So just open this up a little bit more. So I definitely like the direction your character's taking. I think you've got a good kind of character design. I love the kind of weird Oreo cookie eyes and legs. Everything I think is working well. What I think you still need to work on a little bit more is the layer masks. So, with the layer mask, what you want to do is you want to make sure you get rid of all of the background. So these looks like your arms and your legs are the areas that are most problematic. So there can be a number of reasons why layer masks don't quite work when you just, apply a layer mask, make a selection. The first is that maybe your selection, your initial selection, needed some, additional tweaking. That can happen. Like, for example, let's just use this leg here. So what I sometimes will do when a layer mask is problematic is just simply delete the layer mask and start again and see if there's a way to make it a little bit better. Sometimes just doing that and doing it again can help. This is definitely, I noticed and the other reason why sometimes a layer mask doesn't work that well is because your initial photograph can be a little blurry. Like, can you see these edges are a little blurry? If you have sort of a low resolution image, it makes it a lot harder for the layer mask, for Photoshop to do the layer mask. Okay, so you might want to keep experimenting. I think these are Twizzlers, and I'm sure there are a ton of Twizzler, if you go to Google Images, a ton of Twizzler images out there that you can find. So I'm just going to kind of drag here and see. Okay, and then I'm going to select it. I'm going to apply the layer mask. So that wasn't much better. So I can try it again, but normally when you do, let's try just kind of tapping it gently. When you do layer masks, yeah, so that's a little bit better. So you can definitely get a little bit better layer mask. So when we zoom out, that already, can you see that it's actually a much better one? So that might be all you need, but I would experiment with, a better Twizzler photograph, because I think that'll just make your leg look better. Then you can do the same thing with here. You can delete these layers, delete the layer here, the layer mask for this guy, and select it again, seeing if you can just really kind of clean these edges up. Okay, and that's one of the main things I want you to work on. And then the eyes here, you want to make sure that the eye doesn't get stretched, right? So it looks like it's kind of got a little bit. Sometimes you can just tweak it now at this point. I like the idea of it being tall. I think it's a really cool idea to have kind of a elongated eye, but you want to make sure that you don't do that to your objects. Otherwise, they look a little weird. So you could just maybe make your eyes a little bit bigger. You could put it on stalks. You know, you could kind of get some kind of little stalk that would make it, I don't know if that would work for your character. There's a little bit of white here too. So I would keep working on all of your, any white, zoom in, really try to get that layer mask working. Okay, so that's the main thing here that I want you to work on then. I think your text is okay for now, but your background, so your background, I like the simplicity of it, you know, and I like the color, but I think you definitely want to have some more context here for Flippin' Food, Fred. You know, you want a simple, maybe a simple photograph, like maybe of some, you know, just think of something like some subway tile, or a wall, you know, in a kitchen, or a floor. Those can be great sort of backgrounds for this particular character. Okay, so you want to replace that. The other thing you want to do here is I would move your text, you know, somewhere maybe above here, you know, maybe move your character down or down below its feet a little bit. So you kind of, and then I would take the crop tool and crop so that you don't have so much excess space around your character. You want to frame your character. Okay. In general, when we have a portrait, like when you have like a figure that's like tall like this, you use up what's called a portrait format to frame it. So that's what I'd work on here. I think you're going in a good direction, and I think, you know, working on the layer masks, adding a background, and then cropping it, you'll be, if you do those things for week 4, you'll be ready to go to next week and, you know, with, um, ready to go with that. Hey, Lori, well, by now you probably know, just based on what I've talked about before, that you probably are going to have to make a simpler background, that this is just a little too complex. As really wonderful as this background is, you know, so much wonderful detail and lighting, you know, a more complex background can work with other types of projects. It just so happens that the character design is really one where the idea of a background and really negative space background is really so important. So I keep working on it. If you like the idea of having your character standing on a table, I would find a really simple table, you know, sort of just kind of keep those examples we looked at the very beginning in mind when you look for one. I think your text looks good. I think that's, you know, it's got a nice homey sort of friendly feeling, which I think suits your character really well. And you had your layer masks in place last week, so that looks great. And I think your character is coming along. We may have more to say about it next week, but for now, I think I would just work on, you know, finding a good background, experimenting maybe with some different options. Okay, Tracy. Okay, yeah, so I like the idea of having sort of like a tire behind your character. I think that could really work, something quite simple. Um, let's see, I think you had 2 versions here that you were showing. Okay, so this is one without your background, and this is one with your background. Yeah, so I would say, so a few things. Uh, so I think I may have mentioned this last week that you want to make sure that you frame your character just like what I did with Iman's work. You know, just take your crop tool here and just crop down your design so that you've got, you know, you've got it really framed. Okay. And then you can go in here and take your text and just copy it somewhere here. So that's, you know, kind of all of the elements you want to have with the, you know, a better framing. So then what I would do is just keep experimenting with your background. Right now, I think it still is a little bit busy for your character. So I would keep working on that background, you know, like experimenting maybe with other backgrounds or, you know, seeing if you can somehow frame it a little bit. I may have, with the crop, I may have actually deleted some of the background, but maybe sort of zooming in here or finding just a single tire, in focus tire that you could put behind it, you know, or a concrete wall that looks a little bit like distressed. Sometimes students have done something like that, like a floor or a wall that looks kind of dirty or distressed. Something really simple, like, you know, I think your inclination to go with the tire is a good idea, but I do think it's probably, especially because the colors are so similar to your character, I think it's kind of getting in the way. So I'd keep, you know, I'd keep experimenting with that background. And oh, here's your text. Or did I pull it in? I don't remember what happened. Let's see if we can turn that off. So that's the main thing with your character design. So some things I would keep working on your character design now that it looks like you've got your layer masks in place, which is great. Looks like you have worked on that. Yeah, good, great. So some things, what would I do here? So one thing I would do is I would probably make both of your arms the same because symmetry is what makes your character really come to life, I think. So, for example, I would make maybe both of these. I think the toilet roll is one that I think is a really good element. So I might just duplicate this and move one of these over here, replace the plunger with that. And then maybe you could use the plunger maybe for some feet. Have you thought about that? Maybe adding some feet or, how would your character move? Maybe it would have wheels or maybe it would have a bunch of little, like maybe it could have a bunch of little plungers that it would jump around on. That could be kind of cute. So you could kind of think about that, how that might work. Um, Okay, I think those are the main thing. I also think the face maybe, I think once you get the arms and legs in place, maybe you wouldn't need these facial elements, but I would keep experimenting a little bit more with the body. And then next week we can reevaluate. It's always good to kind of add things, take things away, and really experiment at what would make your character really the strongest it possibly can be, most powerful character. Okay, everybody, I think that is it for today for this week's group critique. I think everybody's project is coming along nicely, and you just want to keep experimenting and really having fun with your design and keeping some of these points in mind. Let me know if you have any questions.